So I'm here with Boas Bamberger, one of my co-authors on this paper. The second co-author is Dominic Vilgos, who recently left the University of Mannheim after successfully completing his PhD thesis. As Paige said, the title of this paper is Wage Inequality, Its Impact on Customer Satisfaction and Firm Performance. So by wage inequality, to be precise, we talk about wage inequality within a company. So that means the inequality between the CEO's compensation and an average worker compensation. So let's present some facts regarding wage inequality. First of all, wage inequality is a global trend. Over the past 10 years, it has increased in Germany by 22, in Britain by 17, and in the US by 18%. And here are some numbers who show how drastic this issue is by now. So to earn a top manager's annual wage, an employee must work 36 years in Germany, 55 years in Britain, and 135 years in the US. So wage inequality in companies is very big and it is increasing. Now, is this a problem? Yes, it seems to be. At least on the societal level, organizations like the OECD, for example, have found that it is harmful at the societal level. What we want to look at in this study is whether firms have an incentive to raise or reduce wage inequality. So specifically, we look at 4 issues. How does wage inequality influence employee behaviors directed towards customers? Specifically, we look at how it will affect opportunism against customers. We'll come back to that later on. How does wage inequality influence customer-oriented organizational culture? And ultimately, how does it influence customer satisfaction and profitability? We have 2 analyses here. We have 2 studies here. One looks at short-term profitability. The other one looks at long-term profitability. And we have quite interesting results here. Now, with this introduction, let me share the presentation with Boas Bamberger.
Thank you. Let me give you a quick introduction to our conceptual development and conceptual thinking. We are looking at this issue from a tournament theory perspective. That means we have wage inequality, and from the tournament theory perspective, wage inequality would motivate employees at all hierarchical levels to improve their performance in order to enhance the chances for promotion. Now, to enhance the chances for promotion, they could either increase competitive behaviors, such as showing more effort or cutting corners, that is showing opportunism, or they could reduce also collaborative behavior. Reducing collaboration would then lead to less knowledge exchange, would also lead to less shared understanding of customers, and then in the end to a weaker customer-oriented culture. To make this a little more tangible, take for example a sales employee who could increase the effort towards customers by increasing how often the person interacts with customers. Also, the salesperson, on the other hand, could tell the customer that the product quality is superior while it actually is not, in that way lying or being dishonest to the customer and thereby achieving sales. And both these tactics or approaches could lead to more revenue and improving thus the chances of getting promoted. Same, like less collaboration may occur because the employees are more focused on getting promoted. If we extend this model to then customer satisfaction, we would propose that effort positively influences customer satisfaction quite intuitively. More interaction should increase an understanding of the customer demands. Opportunism, on the other hand, should backfire, thus reducing customer satisfaction, and a customer-oriented culture has previously been shown to improve customer satisfaction, thus we imply a positive effect. Also, we then say customer satisfaction, of course, improves short-term profitability and long-term profitability indirectly, and wage inequality also should have a short-term profitability direct effect, but no effect on long-term profitability.
Okay, then let me go on with the findings of the first study. Here we looked at the short-term results of wage inequality, and basically we found that it harms customer satisfaction, but it improves short-term profitability. So here we have a sample of 106 B2B focused firms. All of them are publicly listed. They come from 3 countries, namely Germany, the UK, and the US. We have key informant data where we looked at things like customer satisfaction, and we have objective wage inequality and financial data. So basically, we found that wage inequality increases customer-directed opportunism. As Boas explained before, this means the readiness to cheat customers a little, the readiness to tell wrong things to customers. So this is increased by wage inequality. At the same time, and this was a very strong effect, it reduces customer-oriented culture. It harms, thus, customer satisfaction, and overall, it slightly improves short-term profitability. That means the direct effect on short-term profitability is positive, which is confirming tournament theory, but in the same time, we have strong indirect effects through opportunism and through customer-oriented culture, and finally through customer satisfaction, which are negative. Interestingly, there was no effect via effort, which in this study was measured as frequency of interaction with customers. Now, the second study looked at long-term effects. And here we found that the short-term profitability boost of wage inequality vanishes in the long run. So in the long run, there's no positive direct effect of wage inequality on firm profitability. However, the negative indirect effects remain. So wage inequality still harms customer satisfaction and has no overall effect on long-term profitability. So the interesting thing about these 2 studies is the results differ between short-term and long-term profitability.
And that is interesting, you may say, but can we give you a practical example? Yes, we can. We looked basically at what happens if we look at a 1% increase in wage inequality in our study 2 sample. And what we see is that this 1% increase in wage inequality results in approximately a $190 million increase in profit over 1 year. However, looking at the long-term, the aggregated long-term effect is negative $7 million US. Thus, as Christian told you, there is the short-term positive effect vanishes in the long run.
Okay, so what is in this study for managers, for shareholders, and finally for policymakers? It depends, of course, how the goal function of managers looks like. And especially in publicly traded companies, we have the situation that quite often managers are strongly measured on short-term profitability. So if managers aim for short-term profitability, they can accept higher wage inequality, but then they should at least be very conscious about the potential negative employee behaviors and distraction from customer needs. If managers are interested in the long-term success of their firm, they should consider reducing wage inequality. Now, looking at shareholders who are usually interested in long-term profitability of their investment, they should reward top managers for sustainable profitability and for good customer relationships as well. So
lastly, wage inequality is not only, or more importantly, not only a topic for companies, but more importantly also for society. So the question is here, what can policymakers learn? And from our results, policymakers should note that wage inequality is not necessarily in the best interest or in the best long-term interest of a firm, and they can use this argument as this validated argument to create consensus with managers to actually restrain wage inequality in companies. Despite this argument, policymakers might still need to disincentivize short-term oriented managers from raising wage inequalities, as the individual personal incentives may be stronger than the long-term effect, which is not significant. And from this, that is it from our side. We're looking forward to your questions, and thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for the insights on this really important topic that's only increasing in magnitude. We have a few questions. The first one, interesting research. Did you look for differences across industries? Is this effect bigger for companies in any specific industry?
No, actually, we could not do that because we were restricted to companies who publish their wage inequality, and thus our sample was pretty small. So we're sorry, we cannot tell you about differences between different industries.
Would you, I'm putting you on the spot, but would you expect to see differences across industries knowing what you've learned through this research?
So we would definitely expect that in companies where there are a lot of blue-collar workers, the wage inequality might be higher. So depending on the workforce composition, of course, there might be stronger wage inequality sizes than in companies with a lot of white-collar workers.
That makes sense. We have a few more questions. Let's see. You've talked about consumer-directed effort and opportunism of sales and marketing employees. Does your model also apply to non-customer facing employees?
We did not analyze these employees, these non-consumer facing employees in the study. Actually, JM reviewers asked us to speculate a little, and yes, we think to some extent it also applies to non-consumer facing employees. If you think about R&D employees, they might, for example, design products which may fail earlier. That's kind of opportunism. Accounting people may make the company look better than it actually is in the eyes of the customer. So we think there are some potential effects, but probably they would be smaller than the effects that we observed.
Great, thank you. Another question, you have looked at how wage inequality shapes employee behavior. How about wage inequality between the CEO and the rest of the top management team?
Yeah, well, again, we can only speculate about this, but it depends a little on how big you define the top management team. I think if you only look at the board, then I think there would be no effect. But if you look at management levels 2 and 3, then this tournament theory would still apply, and we would still expect the same effects to appear. So if you define it in broader terms, the top management team, we think that, yeah, these effects would appear.
That makes sense. Great. Let's see, we have a few more for you. What was the minimum and the maximum wage difference that you might have identified among the large firms you studied?
Any numbers on this?
Yes, I think we had like average numbers. We showed them on slide 2. that were the numbers of 36 to 1 in Germany, 55 to 1 in the UK, and 134 to 1 in the US, which is restricted to our sample in study 1. We have seen firms, for example, in the paper, we give an example of Disney, which has a wage inequality of 1,200 or more to 1. So a worker would have to work for more than 1,000 years to actually earn the annual wage of a top manager.
Certainly an extreme example. So it is high variance. I think that's one thing you've discovered, and country by country differences exist. Let's see, what would be interesting is to know the differences per country in regards to the potential long-term losses. Do you want to address that topic?
That is an interesting question. We have not looked into this specifically. We would have to look into it. We can only speculate that as wage inequality decreases, there should be less of a negative or less of a long-term negative effect.
Right. All right. So here's another one for you. Based on your research, can you give policymakers any specific recommendations on how to reduce wage inequality?
Generally speaking, I'm always skeptical about political solutions, which means ultimately to create new laws. But what policymakers can do at least is they should communicate to companies that wage inequality is not in a firm's long-term interest. This is what our study shows. So they somehow can use this argument to create consensus with managers to restrain wage inequality. So that would be our basic recommendation for policymakers.
Right, and you may not be able to answer this, but when you look at the country-to-country differences you're discovering, how much do you think is attributable to policy and how much is just culture?
Interesting question. If you look at the US, for example, they are very much dominated by large publicly traded companies which have a huge value. If you look at the German economy, we have much more tradition of, well, we also have a lot of publicly traded companies, of course, but we have many more small and medium-sized family-owned companies. So I think, and here wage inequality is not really an issue, right? So I think that cultural differences play a really significant role.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting topic, and to look at these systematic differences across the different markets is important. I have one more question coming in. Let's see. How do you think companies can reduce wage inequality without reducing employee incentives for a promotion?
Well, let me answer this way. First of all, I'm as far away from socialist ideologies than anyone can be. But I think in some companies, top managers are really exaggerating their salaries. So my recommendation would be for the supervisory boards of this company to have a stronger limiting influence on top managers' compensation.